So
Yeah, blue is fine.
let me start with
More
you,
CO2.
Mariette, if it is okay. Let's talk on more open questions on like how should like policy and the industry work together, and how should the synergies in order to develop the CCS industry?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for asking me here. I'm listed as independent expert. I worked for Shell for 30 years until about 6-7 years ago. So, and worked on CCS. The Barendrecht project that was discussed this morning was one of my first projects. I think what I've learned both working at Shell and afterwards is that in the end, what determines a company's performance is the regulations. So if you look at differences between emissions in companies in different countries, it's 90% explained by regulations more than by the corporate central policy. So that's why I'm a firm believer now for scaling up, that you have to move from the initial subsidies and one by one project approvals to more enduring regulations where you have mandates or other ways of forcing companies to keep scaling up CCS, basically.
Perfect. Carl, I don't know if you want to expand on that, and also from your perspective, the market just talked about that they need to like move forward from subsidies. How can like the CCS industry also become more bankable?
Sure. So I guess I'll just do a little bit about Infinium. So Infinium is a large UK energy from waste business. We've got 6 assets in the UK. We process about 2 million tons of unrecyclable waste. So that would otherwise go to landfill, which is very bad for the climate. So at the moment, our sort of decarbonisation solution is to prevent that from happening. But we want to go one step further and decarbonise our emissions. And the only way to do that for an energy from waste plant is to do CCS. There is no alternative pathway. So we've been looking at in the UK, how do we roll out CCS across our portfolio? I think going back to the theme of the panel, I guess the UK has been a very interesting market, like a lot of in Europe, where we've gone over the last few years from first principles of how do you create that overarching market framework that brings investment into the sector. And then thankfully, we're now at a stage where we're starting to see FIDs being taken on projects across the UK, and the discussion is already very quite quickly moving on to how do we move away from those institutions and frameworks and try to have a more market-based solution, as you referenced. So I guess thinking about the question, I guess 2 things from my perspective. One is, I think in terms of how we can collaborate better as an industry with policymakers, regulators. What we have done in the UK is we've put a pilot plant on our largest facility in the UK, and we put that in place in September. That's capturing a ton of CO2 a day, and that's been incredibly helpful, helping policymakers who, and I think this is probably typical for most countries, they're typically based in a large capital city. They haven't probably ever visited the physical infrastructure that's there already, let alone understand what CCS is. So being able to bring investors, policymakers to see the physical infrastructure and talk them through the process engineering associated with that, which I think is probably common knowledge for everyone here in this room because we're all advocates and champions and experts in CCS, but for most policymakers it's quite novel. That is a very powerful tool to, I think, help build trust and confidence and understanding. And certainly we've seen that at our facility in West Yorkshire in the UK. On the how do we move away from where we are today to a more market-driven approach, very happy to pick that up in a subsequent discussion, but should I hand it back over to you initially to give some initial opportunity to do intros?
Yeah. Well, that's open to ask you, Andreas, from your perspective, how it has been the relationship with regulators and policymakers. What do you think or they need in order to improve their approach, and how you from the private sector can help with that?
Yeah. So just for context, at Paebbl, we are within the CCUS space. We are the U and the S part. So we're scaling up a technology focused on CO2 mineralization that takes captured CO2, stores it permanently in a mineral form, which also happens to be a cement-like mineral product. So on one hand, helping provide an on-site permanent carbon sequestration solution while producing a material, a decarbonized raw material, actually carbon negative or carbon storing raw material for an industry who is direly looking for decarbonized raw material streams. When it comes to policy collaboration for us, and if you look more broadly, I mean, we as humanity, we emit something like 50 billion tons of CO2 into the air every year for now. In order to cut that down, of course, there's a part for carbon capture to play. Probably much of it will go underground, but a lot of it might be utilized in some ways. Because even if we decarbonize all of those manufacturing or energy generation processes, we will still, on the other hand, have to make a lot of materials somehow. And a lot of materials that humans make, just from first principles thinking, contain a lot of carbon and a lot of oxygen. So when it comes to specific solutions from the policy perspective, what I think would be very interesting to see, and we are seeing the first potential signs for it in Europe right now, is to work both sides at the same time. Create policy-based incentives that may be regulations that enforce certain kinds of emission levels that are even allowed. But then, in addition to the stick, hopefully also provide a carrot, financial incentives, other kinds of incentives to help cut down on those emissions. But at the same time, also put in place policies that are driven by the public sector, broadly speaking. They can be national governments, regional governments, on green materials procurement that may be based on circular carbon-based materials. And that would essentially be a policy framework that would help solve both problems at the same time. It would help advantage CCUS projects and the procurement and deployment and market introduction of carbon storing or circular materials on the other hand. That is something that is luckily already happening in Europe. Europe now already has a carbon removal certification framework, which is a brand new piece of work, or fairly brand new. There's also a framework for carbon storage in products that has also come alive. It is not yet broadly deployed across the different member states, but the potential for binding the emissions reduction into carbon storage in products and having a robust regulatory framework around it is already there. So getting further on it and being more specific about it probably will require greater knowledge, as you were saying, Carl, on the policymaker side of what is already out there, what may be possible, what is going to be in the near future commercially viable pipeline, so that there can be a better base of knowledge from which the policymaking decisions are being made.
Perfect. And that leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, Ralph, on which, like you were mentioning carrots and sticks, and like which are the carrots that you like to see from the regulators in order to develop this sector, like as methods?
Thanks for the question. I like this morning's ascent showing. So who knows Evonik? Wow. Okay, so it's a chemical company, and we produce in that specific kind here additives, products which enable CCUS, but also other technologies. And if you think about which framework do we want to see, first of all, I think we need a strategic roadmap. We are coming from Germany. Right now, we don't have a clear regulation in Germany. There are today roughly 700 million tons CO2 emitted in Germany. In 2045, we want to be net zero, which then I think the estimate is 50 to 100 million tons still emitted, hard to abate, as I learned today, possible to abate. And so we need a framework. How do we get there? And then regulatory. We don't have yet the acceptance of carbon storage or transportation in Germany. I think the mindset is changing, that it's more accepted. And I hope we will continue that path. So at first we have the acceptance, the regulation. And I think then that's a question like we discussed all today, how do you finance it, right? So that's a second big topic. And how does it fit with the increased carbon pricing? How does it fit with CBAM in the future? And right now, we don't have that security. We don't know how to plan. We don't know really the regulations, not only us, because we supply some of companies present here who then establish technologies. And we are all looking for that a little bit. How do we get those investments? In our case, from a pilot plant now to a really larger plant.
I would like to follow up with a question to you, Ralph, and then I will go to you, Tim. But you just said that the mindset is changing? You mean the mindset of the regulator, the mindset of the public towards CCS, and what is driving this change? According to you?
One thing I would say, it's parties, right? We have still in the government the Green Party, who I think years ago was strictly against it. Maybe also for the reason, first we should reduce before we should store. Then there was also this talk about potential earthquakes and other arguments. I think that's changing. I think the head of the Green Party also said he's supporting CCS. So I think that's a very good sign, whatever the future government is, because he represents a certain amount of people. So that's changing, and now it's coming into law, I think. So there are steps now that it's also being accepted in Germany. So, and then acceptance in the public, I'm not sure yet there, right? It's if it's offshore, I think nobody really is so afraid about it. But of course, onshore there will be discussions.
Probably like the
Because you have this comparison to shale gas, and also there's no shale gas in Germany, right?
Yeah.
At least not. There is shale gas, but not utilized.
And Tim, on your experience, how social industry and regulators work together in order to develop?
Thanks very much. Hi, I work for Storegga. We are an independent project developer of carbon solutions and stores with interests in North America, UK, Europe, and lately Southeast Asia. It's a really good question. And I think the answer is we have to work with the policymakers and regulators. And we've heard a lot today about what policies need to be in place. But I think just offering up 3 ideas this afternoon for discussion, perhaps. First of all, how we can build pipelines of modular and scalable CCUS projects. Secondly, how we can work together to reduce the project risk on risks that exist to make them real. And then lastly, how we can go about all getting better through shared learning. So I think in the first instance, this has to be a market-driven environment. That is, developers, transporters and customers need to move forward to policymakers, decision makers with CCS projects that they think have got legs. And we've heard today about how we need to mitigate that timing difference between FIDs. What we ask for policymakers then is to have clear, straightforward, simple processes that are well understood in advance, so we understand what the rules of the game are as we're putting in these applications. Then we need to design a system in a way which can grow to meet future demand whilst being economically viable at a small scale. That is, we need to allow the system to grow at its natural pace rather than feel like we need to move immediately into a big bang mode. Reducing project on project risk is an area of commercial and contracting innovation, perhaps to some extent. How can we get smarter about working together across the entire regulator, across the entire value chain, that from government, policymakers, developers, transporters, customers and technology providers, so that we've all got some skin in the game and some risk reward at early stage of project development. This will help, I think, have a clear line of sight to what the value chain needs initially in a project and help unlock demonstration or pilot projects which have got commercial scale in the future. And then shared learning, I think as an industry, for very good reason, knowledge and learning isn't quite there yet because the industry hasn't taken off. But where there is learning and knowledge, we perhaps need to get better at sharing that. And one of the things we could do perhaps is expand the remit of regulators to help disseminate that learning and best practice to everybody so we can enjoy that benefit. And with that, of course, comes efficiencies, cost down, de-risking, and then opens up more accessibility and investment to projects.
Perfect. Thank you. I really like that part of the shared knowledge. Margaret, in a previous conversation, you mentioned the need or a good policy would be to have like increasing mandates of CCUS. Would you like to expand on that policy?
Yes, I would always like to expand on it. Basically what we're working on is what called extended producer responsibility regulations, but then for fossil fuels. So for solid waste, it's a very accepted kind of policy where you say this industry sells plastics or batteries or car tires on the market. And if you want to sell product X on this market, you have to set up a collection system so that customers who are done with your product can give their waste back to you and you collect it and recycle and dispose of it responsibly. So basically what we're saying is you need to start introducing that gradually also for fossil fuels. So you start, say, with a very small percentage, 10% in 2035 or so. So 10% of all fossil carbon brought on the market has to be recovered and properly stored. And you can reuse it also if you can show that it stays in the system, but it's got to be collected and taken out, make sure that it's not in the atmosphere. And then you gradually increase that to 50% and to 100% in the net zero year. And that way you incentivize the producer, just like you do for other products. You say, be aware, if you sell a product on the market, you got to think about the waste of that product. And you give the producer a legitimate role to harass their customers and say, do you want to give me back the CO2? Because I need it, because I have this take-back obligation. Or do you want to just keep burning it, and then I will at some point have to do expensive direct air capture and removal, because I have to recover it from the atmosphere for you, and you will see that in the price, of course, because I basically have to get to net zero in 2050. So if you keep burning it, then I have to do removals to get to a net zero product. So that way, together with the ETS price or a carbon tax, you have pressure both on the emitter and on the supplier of the fuel. And at the moment, a lot of emitters complain that the fossil fuel companies are kind of sitting back and have a position of too much power in setting the price and in not being proactive in developing transport and storage, because they don't have any skin in the game. And a producer responsibility regulations would give them real skin in the game, because it would become a license to operate for them to scale it up.
Yeah, that's how to get involved the fossil fuels industry in CCS is something I wanted to touch a little bit later. Andreas, do you, from someone who focused on the U and S part of the business, what do you think about these increasing mandates? Obviously,
I think it's a very interesting idea, and I believe, if you look at what the ETS system has done, it is currently driving even commercial decisions to decarbonize. It is driving corporates' willingness and actual capital allocation decisions, both on new technologies and exploring new pathways for trying to utilize alternative raw materials to transition into fully renewable energy, and so on and so forth. So I would say that it's definitely has been a powerful tool in industry decarbonization. So I would be very curious to see what such a framework would actually do and how quickly.
Yeah.
And maybe one interesting analogy there is what has already been put in place in Europe for the sustainable aviation fuel case, where you have mandated quotas of CO2-based or fully biogenic-based or circular CO2-based fuel that has to be used out of all jet fuel that is being used. And that has, of course, created a fantastic opportunity for the whole SAF industry to invest into actual commercial scale production assets. I think it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
Perfect. We're having some policies coming out from this panel. Carl, I wanted to ask you something about, you mentioned again, like how projects need to increase the financial excel and the financial probability. And what are the main barriers for the projects not becoming like completely bankable and not becoming like successful in terms of finance?
Sure. Well, if I reflect on the experience in the UK, if we go back 10 years ago, the UK went through a process of trying to get CCS commercialized, and it failed primarily because there was a focus on full chain projects. And obviously what happened was there was a lot of cross-chain risk exposure, and people passed that risk between the different parties, and that drove up costs. And I think risk, it was a big focus of the investment session earlier, risk equals cost in CCS, right? So I think what we've done Subsequently, as we've broken down the chain in the UK and we've got business models for different hard-to-abate sectors, which I think is very welcome. So that is a positive step. But I think that risk allocation piece is still fairly immature. I mean, we're seeing this with the first projects that are going to FID in the UK. I think people are still trying to feel out where the risk should sit and whether that should be mitigated by things like insurance or from the UK government as a kind of insurer of last resort. And I think there's still quite a lot of work to do still to find that perfect balance. Some of it is there's real risk and there's perceived risk, right? And because we haven't done enough of these at commercial scale, I think it's hard to unbundle those two things. So hopefully some of that will become easier over time. And I think we still, I think, struggle with some tensions around, a government will want to take risk in certain areas and not other areas, but actually in some areas, if they took that risk, we could actually deliver a lower cost project from a financing perspective. So I think trying to understand where those points of tension are will continue to be a organic process in the years to come.
Yeah, of course.
There's, I think this is a really interesting point. And if you look at how this is currently being done among other CCUS or green energy deployment projects, is that either the startup or the scale-up or the project developer is taking on more risk by owning more and more of the total project deployment, and they take on the responsibility of chunking it into parts that are more palatable, either for the financier or the insurance provider, if there's a commercial insurance provider. The other thing is that you start seeing emerging totally new insurance companies that are entering the market, for example, on the side of voluntary CDR, like Kita, for example, that aims to ensure risk of non-delivery for the CDR buyers. So the new players entering the market. And then you even have, if you start really looking at what the risk actually consists of, exactly as you said, there's real risk and there's perceived risk. Oftentimes it's perceived risk, which is the main first barrier. There are specialty outfits even targeting that particular solution. There's a company called New Energy Risk based in the US, who provides technical assessment essentially as a service to insurance providers and capital providers by taking on the technical part of the due diligence of a new yet unproven, at scale unproven technology in an effort to make more capital available or to make insurance products available for the project to be able to be deployed. So there's movement in the space, but I agree it's early.
Perhaps offer something, just building on those points as well. I think there's be mindful of what you're asking for in terms of risk as well, because what we have perhaps in the UK is a very well thought through business model approach where cross-chain risks have been thought about and underwritten by the government in many ways. It's very complicated, don't get me wrong. But what goes hand in hand with that is it becomes quite an expensive instrument for government as well. Yeah. So affordability comes into play. And then you're sort of running the risk of the level of risk that you're looking for government to underwrite and ultimately the speed at which that project can progress because of affordability. So there's sort of a balancing parts, I think.
I don't want to continue without mentioning the ETS system again. Of course, it's a great system. Unfortunately, only significant carbon pricing in Europe so far. And until 2030, right, it will be 132 euros, depending on, but in all other regions, not important. So I think it has to prove now that we can also produce in energy-intensive industries in Europe at all. So for us, for our industry, for chemical industry, if the carbon price in Europe comes the same, we will reduce our amount produced here. There's no question about it. And I don't want to, steer our discussion in different direction. But now, how do we use that system or new systems to get a new technology off the ground, whereby not destroying old technology or existing technology? And we want to green it, right? Just to make sure Evonik also commits to 25% reduction. We're investing in CO2 reduced, and I totally support that. It's just a question, how do we protect or not destroy existing technologies, and at the same time developing new ones. And we are investing a double-digit million into CCU, CCS, membranes, all the technologies which enable that. And a lot of companies we are working with are here in the room to bring this to scale. And there I'm afraid of, and a pure incentive system or a punishing system, incentive system like ETS, I don't think that will get us off the ground, because now we need then investing 3-digit million, and there we need probably support to get those technologies off the ground.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Please.
Is the main risk the level of the ETS price or the uncertainty about where the ETS price is going and whether it will actually go?
Right now we work with the forecast, right, of very well-known companies. It might now, with the new industrial Green Deal, questioned if it's going there. But if you see that, just those forecasts, which we take in our calculation, which we also put into investment plans, in certain of our business in Europe, we will not be competitive against companies producing outside Europe. Just with this forecast. And that's, but I don't want to steer the discussion in a totally different direction, but it's just how do you compare that, right? All technology new, how do you get it new off the ground? And what is a good system to get it? Because just setting a price for CO2 will not get us off the ground, I believe.
And I would like to open the floor for questions. Anyone in the room who would like to ask something to our panel? Yes. Can you have a microphone? Swanson. Can you stand up, please?
Hi, Walid Sino from Sequestra. My question, I agree actually with with you, Ralph, that it seems that the system has an issue. My question is to Margaret. Do you agree that the 45Q has attracted in the US more investments from the private sector in operationally deployed projects than in Europe?
Yes, I do. I think 45Q is a typical American versus the EU approach, where you just say it's a tax credit and come get it. And if you can actually capture CO2 at half the price, you make a huge profit. If your CO2 capture price costs are $10 per ton more, then you cannot do the project. So from a European perspective, we say, oh, you shouldn't do that because you're overpaying one and the other one you're just missing. So you should have specific project levels and calculate exactly how much they need. But I think the nice thing about 45Q is that it gives certainty and companies can start planning. And that's what they're doing. And you see, that's how you scale things. So I think there's a lot to be learned indeed from the IRA approach.
Thank you.
There was another question from around here. Yeah. Can you stand up?
Yeah, with the danger of also steering the conversation a little. Ralph, I think you were talking about the competition position of us with more expensive energy, with more expensive CO2 permits. Is then the risk also that the EU as a market will be passed as a whole because our rules are too tight?
Yeah, as I said, I don't want to totally steer our discussion in a different direction, but it looks like I'm doing so. So let's continue. But I want to get the other technology off the ground. As I said before, not that you get the impression I'm against CO2 pricing or whatever. As I said, we're investing double-digit million in the technologies which are utilized. So we believe we need technologies to reduce CO2. We need technology to utilize carbon, and we are doing that. We're investing it. It's just a question of our existing technologies. There will be certain ones will not be competitive at a CO2 price of 100, where it's in other regions 10, 20, because it makes a difference. And then it's a question, can you operate that facility in Europe? And that's in our company, and now in a lot of probably other companies here, a big discussion. And that discussion probably is the first one in the company before you say, how do I reduce CO2? Because the motivation to do it cannot be this delta of 100 to 90, because the competition doesn't have that. So it's really then IRA way, I would say, is a great system to motivate, right? To you get money back, you get taxes, credits. I think that really would help. Also to get then investments in Germany or Europe, sorry, because it can differentiate us. We have great technologies sitting also here. We have special absorbents, membranes, which really can distinguish us from other regions' competition. And how do you scale that? And how do you incentivize that in a smart way and not just, I'm not saying with a stick, but feels like it.
Anyone in the panel has an answer for?
Well, to me, it's a fundamental problem. On the one hand, for CCS projects, you need an ETS price that steadily increases because you're doing increasingly more difficult point source capture or further away from the storage. So, the technology will improve, but you do the easy ones first and then you do the others. So you need a higher ETS price. So you get this whole creaming curve idea, and that towards 2040, the price gets higher and higher and you start doing all these things. On the other hand, the industry, you don't want to lose the industry. So what you see now is governments subsidizing, putting in contracts for difference, all the other things, which will take CO2 emissions down, which will take the pressure off the ETS price. So actually, by subsidizing all these projects, you're going to keep the ETS price lower that some companies had hoped was going higher, from the theoretical economic models. So, but I think that is the political reality. Whenever the CO2 prices, ETS prices will get too high, there will be enormous pressure on governments to do something about it. So then you get subsidies, and then basically emissions will keep going down. ETS2 is going to be a nightmare also, of course, from that perspective, but there will need to be a lot of subsidies for heat pumps and electric vehicles to get the emissions to go down. So it's the other policies that will make the emissions go down, and the ETS will just be hovering around kind of similar levels as a kind of a last resort thing, I think, and a little bit of a stick.
Yeah.
Maybe just provide another perspective for the sake of argument, since we're on a panel here. Wouldn't it, at least theoretically, the way it should work, right? That if there's an constantly increasing price on CO2, it should create the perfect incentive for, in particular, CCUS or US technologies to be scaled up much more rapidly. That can help make the entire operation of capture plus utilization, in this case, a profit center rather than a cost center. That would be the whole idea. Then you don't have to worry about the price of CO2, but you have the perfect market opportunity for these things to be built out as quickly as possible. Of course, it's the question of time, right? What do you do in the meantime while these technologies are not yet available at scale or at the price point that you would want?
Theoretically, it's an ideal system, but
exactly.
At the moment, all CCS projects are subsidized for a reason. Even though the Portus project, if the ETS price develops as expected, will get zero subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the guarantee. That's why I asked the question, is it...
Yeah.
Because you don't know all these other policies that the governments are going to do suddenly for political reasons, the green industrial policies, which will keep the ETS price low, actually, which, it's a political choice.
I couldn't find a better way to close in this panel, because the next panel, it will be if carbon capture be profitable. So I would like to thank you all for this great conversation, and to invite my colleague Vijay to the stage for the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.